Well, no, I'll do the preliminary statements and then bring up. Okay. All right, we're going to get started. Thank you all very much for coming this afternoon to continue the training. Hope you had a great lunch. So this afternoon's session, we have a lot more great information to help you with your volunteer work at the call-in. So for the folks in the audience, please hold your questions for the presenters until the Q&A session at the end of this afternoon. If you have questions about the afternoon session for the presenters during the Q&A session, please write them on the index cards that you were given. They were in the programs when you received the programs this morning. And then we're going to have staff who will go up and down the side aisles who will collect the index cards from you. The staff will ask the questions from the index cards at the end during the Q&A session later today. So you'll have a chance to ask questions about this afternoon's topics. For the folks watching at home, you can send us your questions using the chat box on the right side of your screen. All viewers, whether here in the audience or at home, can send their questions via Facebook, via our Facebook page at Citizenship Now, or via Twitter at CUNY Citizenship, using the hashtag Citizenship Now. Or you can email questions for the presenters at cunycitizenshipnow@gmail.com. I'll repeat that email again, at cunycitizenshipnow@gmail.com. And as I mentioned during the morning session, unfortunately, we do not have the master iClicker, so we cannot use the iClickers this afternoon for the poll questions. So the presenters, if they have poll questions, will read the poll questions and go through the possible responses and then ask you to raise your hands or respond to which you think is the correct answer. Now, I would like to introduce our next speaker. He's the one and only Allan Warnock, who is our director of CUNY Citizenship Now, who welcomed us all this morning, and he will discuss hot topics in immigration. So could you please give an applause for Allan Warnock. Thank you.
Didn't he do a good job, Mr. Shea?
Was this me? Thank you.
The clicker.
Just go left, forward, backward.
Okay, forward, backward. I think I can handle that. How you doing? You learning something? So, before I go into my talk, I want to thank you again for all coming here. You know, some of you, I see some new faces, and if you're not if you don't have a background in immigration law, and you're trying to absorb all this information in one day, you can't do that. It's impossible. What we want you to do is get enough familiarity so when you get on the phone, you can ask some questions of the callers. And if you're not sure, you're going to have a stop sign to hold up, and we're going to have lots of very experienced attorneys available to answer questions. So please don't be intimidated by the wealth of information that you're getting today. And of course, you have your training manuals, and if you miss something during the talk, you should be able to find the information in your training manual. Okay, so let's get going. Hot Topics Year in Review, that's me. So the three things I'm going to try and talk about, or I am going to talk about, what's happening with deferred action. I'm going to talk a little bit about advanced parole because I've been getting a lot of questions about that, both in my column and from people I run into who are involved in the immigration field. And then I want to talk about what CUNY is doing in response to what's happening with deferred action. Okay, so you're with me. So let's just run through real quickly. These are the things that have gone on. I'll make a little commentary. So, you know, President Obama had two parts of his deferred action program, as you learned this morning. He expanded DACA and DAPA. And on the DACA program was supposed to start on February 18th, and 2 days prior, a federal judge in Texas, in response to a lawsuit brought by 26 states, enjoined, which means stopped, the Obama program from going forward. So basically, he ordered that the Department of Homeland Security could not proceed with the DACA program, with the expanded DACA program and the DAPA program. Of course, the original DACA program that started in 2012 is proceeding fine, and if you run into people who qualify, they can still apply. Now, the judge was a particularly conservative judge. He had a reputation for making a lot of anti-immigrant statements. So I didn't it didn't impress me that he found that the Obama program shouldn't go forward. It didn't really mean very much to me, although it meant a lot to the people that we serve. But in terms of from an intellectual point of view and a legal analysis point of view, it was not impressive. The Justice Department, which represents the Obama administration, tried to asked the judge to lift the injunction. He did not. And they went then to the Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the next court, right? So you have the District Court, the Court of Appeals, Supreme Court, the three levels in the federal system. They went to the Court of Appeals, and they're trying to see what they call a stay. So what they're trying to do is stop the District Court decision. So that's what they're trying to do. And on April 17th, there's going to be an oral argument. Now, there's two important things to know about that. First of all, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the circuit that is responsible for Texas, just a couple weeks ago issued a decision very favorable to our side. And there was a challenge to the 2012 DACA program, and the judge said it was nonsense in essence. I mean, he didn't use that word, but he said that the parties to that lawsuit, which included the state of Louisiana, didn't have the right to go before that court and to make that kind of request. So that's a very positive thing, because that's the same circuit court that is going to be hearing the case we're most concerned about on April 17th. Second, it's a little technical, but I think it's worth your hearing. Usually when these stays are done, when somebody gets an injunction, tries to stop an action, and you go to a higher court and you say, no, you shouldn't let that judge in the district court get away with that. You need to stop him from doing that. They do it on paper. This year, the Fifth Circuit, in a very unusual procedural move, has allowed for 2 hours of oral argument on the stay request. Now, what does that tell me? I may be wrong. I don't know. I'm guessing. But it tells me two things. First of all, they're taking it very, very seriously. They know this is a big deal. And second of all, I see it as a very favorable development, because I think the reason they granted those 2 hours stay is because they're going to rule in our favor. So, I don't know. It's a feeling I have. They're going to rule in our favor. And the reason they're scheduling 2 hours is they want to make sure that the public understands that they've given the other side, the restrictionist state attorney generals, the opportunity to hear present their case. If you look back at the Obamacare debate in the Supreme Court allowed extra time for that decision, and then they ruled in favor of Obama. So to me, it's a good sign. Now, if that doesn't happen, if that happens, we could be starting to do applications as early as the first week of May, at least on the DACA part of it. The DACA part is not to start until May. If that decision does not go favorably, there'll be other appeals and other review. But I'm very confident that eventually, at some point, some court is going to find that the president has the right to do this. It's his call. He has the right to do this. So it's a question of deferring and recognizing that right. So I'm very, very optimistic about it. We don't know for sure. Nobody knows. Anything could happen. But I'm very optimistic, and that's why we spent so much time and are spending so much time talking to you about DACA and DAPA today, so that you can be on the phones with people and give them the advice they need so they can start getting ready. Because those of you who have worked with us on the 2012 DACA program know it often takes a long time for people to get their papers. And also, that program involved only young people, and those people mainly went to high school, mainly went to college, and they had good records. For DAPA, for the parents of U.S. citizens, some of them may never have been in school, so they're going to need more time to gather their documents. All right? You're with me so far? Good. Okay, so let's have a question. Which of the following is true? Tom came here in 1980 at age 15. He has read that he qualifies for DACA. So the question is, he qualifies for the current DACA. The answers are, A, he qualifies for the current DACA program. B, he may qualify for expanded DACA and should start gathering proof of his eligibility. C, transfer his call to the RSV appointment line for an appointment on May 16th, both B and C. So how many people say A? How many people say B? How many people say B and C? How many people see B and C? Very good. The answer is D, B and C. So The reason I wrote the question this way is I want to remind you that on May 16th, we need your help. We want to help over 600 people get counseled on whether they qualify for DACA and DAPA, and many of them will not qualify, but they may qualify for other benefits. This whole DACA-DAPA screening program, the way I see it, it's an opportunity for undocumented immigrants to sit before people who care about them, who have legal expertise, and get good advice. So even if they don't qualify for DACA or DAPA, they're going to get the advice that they deserve. So we need your help on May 16th, so please sign up and come out at John Jay College and help us with that effort. All right? That's a lot of people, 600 people, to try and help in one day. All right. Now, D. Well, I already explained it. All right, so move on. Update. How am I doing on time, Tom? 5 minutes. Oh, I better be quick. Okay, here's the story. Here's the story. I'm not going to read it to you. Here's the story with advanced parole. If people get DACA and DAPA or TPS and they travel with advanced parole, when they come back, they make a lawful entry. If they are an immediate relative of a U.S. citizen, they can interview for their green card here. So Mary gets DACA because she was under 16 when she came to the United States. She gets it under the 212 program. Her grandma's sick. She gets a letter. She travels to Mexico. She comes back. Originally, she had come crossing the border illegally, what we call entry without inspection. But she did. But now, her most recent entry was a legal entry. She marries a U.S. citizen. She gets her green card and lives happily ever after. Okay? That rule, by the way, does not apply to people who are illegally here in other than immediate relative categories. So in the sibling categories, for instance, advanced parole doesn't allow them to adjust status. Adjust status is a term we use for interviewing in the United States. However, if they have to go for an interview at the consulate, follow me now, and they get advanced parole for the purpose of going to the consulate, if for some reason they don't get their green card, they come right back. Okay? All right. So, which of the following is true about Mario? Do I have time for that? Mario? He's a Honduran national. He came here without inspection. His parents, his sisters, and brothers crossed the border at night in 2006. He was just 15 at the time. In 2012, USCIS granted him DACA. In 2013, he goes to visit his grandmother with advanced parole. His petition comes up under his mother, who is a permanent resident. He comes to the front of the line. She filed for him. He's now current, meaning he qualifies to get his green card right away. So which of the following is true? He was inspected and admitted in his last entry. He can adjust status, that is, interview in the United States. This is a hard question, so don't feel bad if you don't get it right, and I'm going to insist that everybody answer, because it forces you to think. See, when I'm a professor, I test people to teach them, not to determine whether they're good people or not. Okay? Since he was inspected and admitted his last entry, he can adjust status. He can interview in the United States for his green card based on his permanent resident mother's petition. B, he can get a green card, but he must return to Honduras for his final visa interview without concern about his prior unlawful status if USCIS granted him a second advanced parole. C, he can get a green card, but he must return to Honduras and apply for a waiver of the unlawful presence bar to permanent residence. D, none of the above. So, you know, as clever professors, we put in none of the above to make it harder for you to guess. Okay, so how many people say A? Please, raise your hand. He can adjust status, right? Because he traveled, he re-entered with a legal entry, he can adjust status. B, he can get a green card, but he must return to Honduras for his final interview. Nobody thinks B is the right answer. Now, one of you thinks B is the right answer. Oh, there we go. We got a few people think B is the right answer. He has to return to get his green card, but he needs a waiver of the unlawful presence bar to permanent residence. Anybody think that's the right answer? Oh, you people are cowards. Okay. The answer is B. Okay. Why? Because his mother is a permanent resident. He was illegally here. In order to adjust status, that is, interview here, you have to have made a legal entry, which he did. Also, you must have never worked without permission or never been here illegally unless you're an immediate relative. So if he comes back with his advanced parole and marries a U.S. citizen, and by the way, since the Defense of Marriage Act, which I talked about in last year in Hot Topics, since that's declared unconstitutional, he can he can have a same-sex spouse and also get his green card. If he gets married, he can interview here, but not based on his mother's petition, because he's in a second preference. It's very complicated. This is a thinking question, okay? And if you didn't get it, you can talk to me later. Okay, and the last question, I think. So here's the pitch. I know you're all going to join us on, clap your hands if you're going to join us on May 16th. All right. Tinkerbell would be very happy. Okay. Poll question. Which is the following true about Justin Bieber? He's Canadian. He can't sing, but he has great abs. Both A and B, or what? How many people say A? A is B. C. D. All right. Okay. All of the answers are correct. Don't you wish you had a professor who graded like that? Thank you so much. I hope I see you all at the reception.
Thank you, Allan. Can I get another round of applause for Allan Warnock? And our next speaker is Midori Hills, who is the staff attorney with CUNY Citizenship Now, and she's going to cover for the next hour citizenship and naturalization. So I just want to point out in your training manual, sections 1 and section 2. The majority of the calls that we get at the call-in each year are naturalization related or citizenship related. So I recommend, if you have time before the call-in itself, please review particularly sections 1 and section 2. And so you get acquainted with it and you'll know where to look things up when you get calls, so you have the information very handy. Because this is why we're spending an hour on citizenship and naturalization, because it's such a big part of the call-in. So thank you, and I'm going to hand it over to Midori. You have the clicker, right? So you know how to use it.
Hello. Can everyone hear me? I don't know how I'm...
Forward.
Right, forward.
Forward,
And
forward,
backward.
back.
Okay.
You
I don't know how I'm supposed to follow Allan, so you'll have to bear with me. This might be a little bit more mundane. So my topic for today is citizenship and naturalization. We've already talked a little bit about this topic already in some of the other sections, including from the introductory part this morning, if you were all here for that. So basically what I want to do is, again, like as Tom mentioned, most of the calls, still a great majority of the calls that we get during the call-in are about citizenship and naturalization. And so that's one of the reasons why we want to spend a bunch of time on this. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about the process of naturalization, what people have to go through, why, and things like that. A little bit about issue spotting as far as what you're going to be doing at the call-in is you're just having a conversation with someone. So what are the things that you're looking for when you're talking to them? What's the language that you're looking for? And based on what they're saying, you're going to start thinking about what it is that they might qualify for, right? So how can we do some issue spotting? And then I also want to talk about acquisition and deriving citizenship, which was also mentioned this morning as far as people who are already citizens, people who don't have to apply to become citizens. So the first thing, and we kind of talked about this in a couple of sections, so who can become a citizen? Basically, if you're born in the United States or in a United States territory, people who are born abroad, even if you're outside of the U.S., if you're born to certain U.S. citizen parents, you might automatically be a citizen. We're going to talk about that acquisition a tiny bit. And then there are people who are not citizens when they're born, but they become citizens later on, and so those are people who are going to naturalize. We're going to spend most of our time talking about that. And then there are other people, mostly children, who become citizens automatically when one or both of their parents naturalize, and that's called derivation. All right, so this slide, I almost thought we could skip it, except I thought it was nice that we made a slide for it. But the benefits of citizenship basically were covered very nicely, I think, this morning by the two people that we helped at the call-in who are now citizens, if you remember, all the way back to 10 o'clock this morning. But they talked about why it's important to be a citizen, because they want to have more, they want to be able to participate more fully in civic life. They want to be able to vote. One of them seems like she could run for office, I think, and probably win. And so, so to be able to do that, you need to be a citizen. So that's a big one. Being able to file for other family members is important. Two of the things I don't think that they mentioned was one of them is the availability of certain jobs, especially federal jobs, often require that you're a U.S. citizen. And then also, I think somebody had mentioned it, but you get the maximum benefits as far as public benefits goes. Citizens, U.S. citizens, all public benefits are available to them, while for permanent residents and non-citizens, they're much more limited. Okay. One of the things that comes up, it's been coming up the last couple of elections, I feel like, is, to run for president, the Constitution says you have to be a natural-born citizen, which basically means that when you're born, you're a citizen. It doesn't mean that you have to be born in the United States, which actually covers, if you remember, John McCain from I don't know how many years ago was born in Panama because that's where his parents were. His father was working in Panama. But because his parents are citizens, he's a natural-born citizen, like that. Okay? So I guess, so just to take naturalization. So naturalization basically is when an adult, a permanent resident who's over 18 years old says, okay, I want to take the next step on this path and become a U.S. citizen. I need to apply for naturalization. So basically there's a few things that have to happen. They have to meet the eligibility requirements, which we're going to talk about. There's a form that they have to fill out, which is something that many people I recognize in the room help us with all the time at our Saturday events and things like that, where we actually sit down and help people fill out the forms. They need to do fingerprints because there's going to be, hopefully, the last time they have to do background checks for an immigration purpose. There's an interview, there's an exam they have to take, and then finally they have to swear an oath to be their allegiance to the United States. Okay, so the minimum to be eligible for naturalization, you have to be a permanent resident. The person has to have their green card. They have to be at least 18 years old, so you have to be an adult. There's a continuous residence requirement and a physical presence requirement, which we'll talk about a little bit. The person has to show good moral character, which I think in past years has been whole sections. I mean, you can spend a half a day or maybe longer just talking about all the different good moral character issues. For purposes of the call-in, I think it's just important for you to remember that it's a requirement. And instead of having to know all the nitty-gritty details of it, just to recognize good moral character is a big deal when someone wants to file for naturalization. So if you're talking to someone and they say, well, because of this criminal thing or because of this tax thing, just enough for you to identify it and say, okay, this might be an issue. Let's see where you can get a good referral. There's a requirement to be able to speak, write, and read basic English. There are certain exceptions to that, which we'll talk about. There's a civics test, which is always on, used to always be on talk show, late night shows, where they do man-on-the-street things and ask U.S. citizens questions from the citizen test to see who can pass it. So I think that the people preparing to naturalize are a lot better on their civics than a lot of people who are born here never had to think about it. And then finally, the person has to be willing to take an oath. Okay, so I don't think I'm going to run through this because I think it was covered very well in the morning as far as who's a permanent resident, what can they do, and what they can't do. So the first thing, we're going to go to the first poll question. Must Min Jun renew his green card in order to apply for naturalization? This is kind of tricky since we haven't really talked about it at all yet, but we'll see. This will be like the baseline question to see where everybody is. So Min Jun obtained his green card through his sister in 2003. He's never traveled outside of the United States. The green card expired in 2013, and he never applied to renew it. He's otherwise eligible to apply for naturalization. So the question is, does he have to renew his green card in order to apply for naturalization? So is it A, yes, because he can't prove that he's a permanent resident if his green card is expired? B, no, because he's still a permanent resident even though the card is expired? C, yes, because he cannot travel outside the United States with an expired green card? Or D, no, because he's still authorized to work with an expired green card? And the answer is, you can just yell it. Did everyone say B? Because B is the right answer. I think it's on the sheet anyway. So the answer is, I am aware of that, but so the answer is B. He does not need to renew his green card in order to apply for naturalization because he's still a permanent resident even if the green card is expired. There's an important note on this, which is that this is a New York district policy, And nationally, it's not the same. So in New York, even if you have an expired green card, you can file for your naturalization. Okay, so it's important actually to make that distinction, because people will always say, well, I had read that I have to renew it first, and so we actually, in the New York district, we are luckier because we don't have to go through that step first before we do it. And it's the other important thing for you to note is that just because the green card is expired doesn't mean that the status is expired. Okay, so sometimes people lose it for, when they had lost their green card so long ago, or, it expired 10 years ago and they didn't notice, or whatever it is. They're still permanent residents. They still have all the rights of a permanent resident. And in New York, that includes being able to apply for naturalization even if they don't have the actual valid card. So, I forgot to click, sorry. So, for there are three separate concepts that we're going to talk about as far as this continuous residence and physical presence. That was one of the main requirements, right? So, the first, continuous residence, means that the person has to be a permanent resident for a continuous period. That's usually called the statutory period, or a lot of people just say 5 years. The general rule is that a person needs to have their green card or be a permanent resident for 5 years before they file for naturalization. There's exception to that. One is, I think it's the next slide, so I won't talk about it. It is the next one. So you generally need your green card for a period of 5 years, right? During that period of continuous residence, there's another concept of physical presence, okay? So physical presence is the actual time that you're physically in the United States. And that requirement is for half of the period of continuous residence, you need to be in the United States, or more than half, which means that if it's 5 years that you have the continuous residence, 2.5 years, more than 2.5 years has to be physically in the United States. Does that make sense? And then the last bit of it is there's a concept that's of abandoning your permanent residence status, which we'll talk about in more detail, but if you leave the United States for long periods of time, if you don't maintain a residence here, if you're taking a job in another country, things like that, you may have been considered to have abandoned your residence. So all three of those things are things that people have to consider as far as that continuous residence period. So it's not just, you've had your green card for 5 years, you're good to go. You got to figure out, were you here enough days? Did you ever abandon it by leaving for too long of a period of time, like that? So those are some of the things we're going to talk about. All right, so the 3 or 5 year rule, right? So usually you need to show the 5 years. And then in the parens, you'll see that it says that you can file the naturalization application 90 days early. So it's actually, you need to be a permanent resident for 4 years and 9 months before you file that naturalization application. All right? The 3 year rule is for people who are married to a U.S. citizen and living with a U.S. citizen. Then you only need to show that you've had your residence for 3 years. All right? So the continuous residence period would be for 3 years as opposed to 5. You have to show that you're living with a U.S. citizen spouse for that whole 3 year period. You have to have your green card for that whole 3 year period. You have to be married to the U.S. citizen for the whole 3 year period, and that spouse has to be a citizen for the whole 3 year period. All of those. So sometimes people are like, well, at the time that you got married, if you married a permanent resident, he or she didn't become a citizen until last year. You only have 1 year, right, living with a U.S. citizen spouse. So it's not enough just that it's the same spouse. He or she has to be a citizen that whole time, like that. So all those pieces have to meet. But if you can show that, then you don't have to wait for the 5 years before you file for citizenship. And then the type gets a little bit small, but you can file 90 days early on that as well, but that's 90 days of being a permanent resident. You have to have been married for more than 3 years at the time that you file, so it's a little bit tricky. And usually you are, especially if you got your residence through the spouse, you will have been. But the marriage has to be more than 3 years, even if the residence is 90 days early. All right, so next I want to talk about breaks in continuous residence. So the continuous, and don't forget, everything's in the first, all the naturalization stuff is in the first chapter of the training manual, because it's the best. And then the second chapter is going to be the acquisition and derivation that we'll talk about a little bit. So for continuous residence, absence, during the statutory period, during the 5 years or the 3 years if it's through a spouse, certain long absences from the U.S. will make it so that you're considered to have abandoned your, broken your continuous residence. Anytime, so usually when we are doing, when you're talking to someone, if someone has a permanent residence, they want to know how long they can leave the country for. Usually you're going to say, you know, you want to be out for less than 6 months at a time. And the reason that that's the case is because if a permanent resident leaves the country for more than 6 months at a time, even if it's less than a year, USCIS can presume that that permanent resident disrupted the continuous residence, that they broke the continuous residence that's required for citizenship. What that means is that they're making this presumption that you broke your continuous residence. So if you want to prove otherwise, you have to show documentation, say, no, I didn't disrupt it because, and you'd have to show documentation that says maybe there was a specific reason why you left for so long, you kept a residence here, you were still, you know, employed in the United States or whatever, your family was here, whatever it is to show that you are still a permanent resident here, that you were still residing here even though you left for a long time. A permanent resident who leaves for more than a year has broken their continuous residence. So now it's not a presumption that you can argue against. If you're out for more than a year, you've broken the continuous residence, and you'll need to start counting those days over again. And that's what the last two bullets are. If a person has been out for more than a year and returns, they reset the clock, but they'll give you 364-day credit. So what it means is when you come back in after an absence of more than a year, you can apply for your citizenship after 4 years and 1 day, all right? And that's, a lot of times if people have to leave for long periods, they may have left with a reentry permit, which is a document they can apply, a permanent resident can apply for before they leave, but it still breaks the continuous residence. But after 4 years and a day, they'll be able to apply for citizenship. In the parentheses, it says 2 years and 1 day if the person is married to and living with a U.S. citizen. This is a rule that I continue to not understand. You should harass Allan about that at the reception later, at the coffee later. If USCIS says that a person disrupted their continuous residence because they left for more than 6 years but less than a year, 6 months but less than a year, then they have to wait the whole statutory period again. They have to wait a whole 5 years, which doesn't make any sense to me. So you can ask somebody for an explanation on that. Or we can talk about it at the call-in if there's ever any downtime there. So that's the continuous residence part. So the next one is about physical presence. So physical presence, like I said, is the time that the person is requires that the person physically be in the United States for more than half of the time, okay? For 5 years, I guess because I've done it so many times, I finally memorized the number. It's 913 days is more than half of 5 years, all right? So keeping in mind the rules about abandoning your residence and keeping in mind the rules about breaking continuous residence, you don't want to be here for 913 days and then leave for 911 days, right? Because that means that you have left for more than a year, right? So you can't, and then if you leave for more than a year at a time, you've abandoned your residence, you've broken the continuous residence. But people are allowed to come in and go while they're permanent residents. So it might be somebody who still has a lot of family back home, so travels home every year for the holidays. So Christmas, New Year's, they're gone for a month. And then summer vacation, when the kids are out of school, they're gone July and August. So you can, so you can leave like that. You can leave for bigger chunks if you want. But the calculation is, of all of those trips in and out of the country, how much time did the permanent residents spend in the U.S.? Was it more than half of that statutory period? Then they're eligible for to apply for naturalization. If they're outside of the country more than they've been in the U.S., then they're not eligible for citizenship. And that's where I usually mention a certain family member of mine who is outside of the country probably 4 or 5 months, and then he'll come back into the U.S. and spend maybe 2-3 weeks here, and then takes off again, will be out for 3 or 4 months, and then come back in again for a couple of weeks at a time. He does this all year, all the time. So if you look at his passport, he's outside of the country way more than he's in the United States. So if he wants to file for a naturalization, he's not going to be able to do it right now because he won't meet the physical presence requirement. But because he never leaves for more than 6 months, he pays taxes in the U.S., he has family in the U.S., and all those other things, he hasn't broken that continuous residence. Does that make sense? All right. So I will thank him for being a good example. All right. So the next poll question on this case study, when can Ahmed apply for naturalization? So Ahmed obtained his permanent residence status through his daughter on April 16, 2010. He visited his home country of Egypt from April 1st, 2012 through May 1st, 2013. Since then, he's not taken any trips out of the United States. When can Ahmed apply for naturalization? January 16, 2015, April 16, 2015, May 1st, 2018, or May 2nd, 2017? I actually can't hear anybody from up here. I'm hearing C, but let's think about, let's see what it is. Now, since I just hesitated, I feel like I'm hearing different answers. The answer is D. I was hoping there'd be a nice explanation on there. Okay, the reason the answer is May 2nd, 2017 is this. So Ahmed left the United States from April 2012 till May 2013, which is more than 1 year, right? So that breaks his continuous residence because he left for more than a year. For absences over a year, you can apply for naturalization after 4 years and 1 day. And so that's why the answer is not May 1st, 2018, which would be a full 5 years, but the answer is May 2nd, 2017, because it's 4 years and a day. Okay? All right, so what is next? All right, the same question, but what if? What if what? Okay, all right, so in 2011, he travels back to Egypt. He's taking care of his sick mother. He returns to the United States after 8 months. He hasn't left the U.S. since, and he wants to know, and he meets all the other requirements. So when can Ahmed naturalize? And the choices are maybe if he has a reasonable explanation for being out of the country for over 6 months, which presumptively breaks your continuous residence. Yes, because he meets the physical presence requirement, which he probably does since it was just the 8 months. C, definitely not, because he was out of the U.S. for over 6 months. And D, certainly, because he meets all the other requirements. So what's the answer? Very good. That one I heard. So the answer is A. Maybe, right. So I guess Carmen was saying it before too, but I guess lawyers love the answer maybe. What are you going to do? If he has a reasonable explanation, so it's more than 6 months, presumptively breaks the continuous residence. Does he have a good reason? I'd say so. His mom was ill, and he had to go back and take care of her, right? And so if you'd have to put it together with other things too, did he maintain a residence here? Did he have still his bank accounts here? Was he paying taxes in the U.S.? All those kind of things, whatever it is, to show that even though he was gone for more than 6 months, he did not break that continuous residence, okay? All right. So the next subject is good moral character. Good moral character is big. We could spend a really long time on it, so we'll see how we do today. A couple of overview things to note about good moral character is that the main period of time that USCIS is concerned with is the statutory period. All right, so say I want to apply for naturalization and I got my green card in 1980. So that's 35 years worth of being a permanent resident that can be considered, right? The main focus for USCIS is usually the last 5 years, the most current 5 years, right? Or 3 if I'm married to and living with a U.S. citizen. It doesn't mean that they can look back further, and we'll talk about that, but the main period that they're concerned with is the most recent statutory period. There's a note that says, yes, people can get arrested at their ceremonies, so just keep that in mind. It doesn't happen that often, but once in a while someone will go through the process, take the test and pass it and everything, and then get arrested, for doing something silly in that 2 weeks between the interview and the swearing in. So it's possible, just keep that in mind. I don't, It's out there. Something that's very important to note as far as the overviews go is that good moral character is not just about criminal conduct. It's not just about whether or not the person's been arrested. It's not about whether the person's been convicted. It incorporates a lot of different issues, and so just to keep an eye out for that too. If someone says, yeah, but I've never been arrested, so it's not like, okay, there you go. Other categories that are listed is child support, taxes, and selective service. So actually, when you look at the yes or no questions on the N400 form, the application for naturalization, you can kind of see what issues the USCIS is looking for. And so we'll talk a little bit about what categories that are not necessarily criminal, but that may have an impact on someone's ability to show good moral character. The form, I think, is in the training manual too, isn't it? So let's type a second to see where that is. Is it in just, I guess it's in the same place. It's in the same chapter 1. So you'll see it as you go through chapter 1. The form is reprinted for you and broken out for you. So you can see those questions too. So good moral character and criminal history. I guess it is the biggest area. Most notably, criminal history and criminal conduct is an issue for immigration because it can affect not just whether or not the person can naturalize, but depending on what it is, it might affect the person's ability to remain a resident. It may have admissibility issues, which was discussed this morning, and it also can have deportability or removability issues. So that's why it's so important, because it's not just that, there's a serious criminal conviction that happened, but it's outside of the 5-year period. Oh, well, Midori said naturalization, really, they want to look at the last 5 years. So you can't be like, oh, well, because that was so long ago, you have no problems, because there may be other issues involved. Is it possible that the person is removable because of this criminal history, or are they, if they travel abroad, is that going to be a problem? There's other issues to think about, which is why I think everyone's so, focused on the importance of getting really good expert help for someone who has a criminal history and wants to do anything with immigration. So for the citizenship, usually things like parking tickets, disorderly conducts, and things like that, usually those kind of, what are they called, scofflaws, things like that are generally not an issue for naturalization, although a pattern of misconduct might. So, if you have so many parking tickets that are unpaid that your car gets impounded and they suspend your license and things like that, it's not the same thing as like one time, dinner ran late and you got a ticket for parking, past the meter or whatever. So if you have a pattern of showing that you're just not really concerned with what the laws are or what the rules are, then they could actually find something negative on your good moral character, even though it's not like a major offense. The other thing to note is that USCIS has increasingly been tougher and tougher on criminal issues, on people who are applying for naturalization. And even a disorderly conduct, which is a violation, it's not a misdemeanor or a felony, even a disorderly conduct for something minor could be a cause for concern for someone who's applying for naturalization, which is disappointing. It makes it a lot harder for the applicant. But that's something that to note. And then finally, the last thing is on the, it says fines, but, fines means like for citations. That's the intention of it. It's not like if you get arrested for something and you take a conviction and you have to pay a fine to the court. That's a different thing, okay? It just means like a, like a ticket, like that sort of fine. So, and I guess I just sort of talked through the next bullet, which is basically you don't want to have, you want to make sure that the person's getting expert help from a good qualified immigration service provider in case there are other issues outside of the naturalization context that are going to potentially affect the person. Okay, so does Bridget qualify to naturalize? I'll give you, you already have it, so I don't have to give you any hints. So Bridget became a permanent resident in 2002. Over the next 10 years, she was arrested 7 times, twice for petty larceny, 5 times for possession of marijuana. It was a tough couple of years. She has 3 convictions for possession of marijuana, but only 1 for petty larceny. She also has 2 disorderly conducts. She meets all the other naturalization requirements. So the question is, does Bridget qualify to naturalize? And the choices are no, because the marijuana charges might be CSOs, which stands for controlled substance offense. B, yes, when the convictions are over 5 or 3 years old, she'll be able to qualify. No, the petty larceny is a CIMT, which is a crime involving moral turpitude, and there are too many marijuana charges. And D, these issues need a thorough review, which is not possible over the phone. Everyone's saying D, right? No one's saying B, right? D you like dog? D you like David? Okay. So yeah, so I was going to say it's kind of a trick question. So obviously, that's a lot of things to go through. You're not going to be able to talk on the phone with somebody and give them, go through all of that and parse it out. I don't think, I think it was mentioned before about getting a supervisor on the phone or things like that. Frankly, I think that without looking at the dispositions, like without looking at them in my hands and being able to go through them with someone, I'm not going to be able to give even decent information. And so even if, if you were on the phone with someone and called over one of the supervisors and said, can you analyze this, you might end up with an answer that sounds more like they need to get all the dispositions and get referred somewhere, just because, they might not be reading it properly or they might be understanding it differently, things like that. So you really, in those kind of cases, I mean, I think even if it's one, but in a case like where there's a lot of paperwork to go through, they really want to sit down. Which leads me to the training manual again. So there are referral sources in Chapter 11, are some referral sources where people can call for help for nonprofits, for private lawyers, things like that. And then I think there's also going to be a separate packet of referrals to different agencies that you'll be able to refer people to at the call-in. And finally, on the last page is all the CUNY centers, but I said finally, because there should be, there are a lot of other organizations in the city that can help people. If you're talking to people from out of state, once it hits the TV and things like that and the Daily News Online, people from all over read it. And so if you've done the call-in in the past, I'm sure you've had it, but people will call from Georgia and, Florida and whatever. And so there are places in Chapter 11 where you will see referral sources for people who live outside of the New York City area. So when you need it, they're in there. So you should use them. You should use those resources. So what's next? Good moral character continued. All right, so we're leaving the criminal context already, which is, we really just touched on it. I mean, we can, the other good moral character issues I want to talk about, taxes is a big one. Not filing your taxes when you're supposed to is definitely a factor that goes against your being able to show good moral character. Note that it has to be where you're required to file taxes. So if the person is a full-time student and doesn't have an income, if the person is dependent on someone else's taxes, then they may not have a requirement to file their own taxes. So in that case, it's not a negative factor, right? But if I've been working and I say, because I've been working off the books, there's really no record of how much income I made, so I'm just not going to file it this year because then I get to keep everything. That's a factor that goes against my moral character. If you're earning income, you're supposed to be paying taxes, right? So anyone who's required to pay taxes should be paying their taxes. And there's a couple of questions on the form, which again are in Chapter 1, that ask about taxes. Since becoming a permanent resident, have you ever failed to file your taxes? Did you ever file your tax? Say you didn't have to file taxes because you considered yourself a non-resident, those kind of things. Okay, so that's in there. Selective service. Does everyone know what selective service is? Okay, all right, so I don't have to talk too much about it. Basically, if any man between 18 and 26 who's in the United States, in any status other than a lawful non-immigrant, which means like an F1 student or a B2 visitor or whatever, anybody else, whether you're undocumented, if you're a permanent resident, if you're a citizen, is required to register with selective service. If you haven't done so, that's a factor against your moral character, and so there's different ways to address that. That's in Chapter 1, and there's also lots of discussions about that. If the person, no, that's all I'm going to say about that. So that information's in the manuals. Because there's a lot of stuff I have to cover, that's why. So the next part is child support. I mentioned it briefly, but child support basically Anyone who has minor children who are not living with them, USCIS considers has an obligation to have some kind of support of that child. And so it doesn't matter if there's no court order that requires it. You don't have to have, they're not specifically just looking for people where, as part of the divorce, the court says you must pay $1,200 every month and you're not paying it. Those aren't the only people that immigration is looking for. If you have a non-custodial child, if you have a child who does not live with you, they want to know that you're doing something to take care of that child. And so that's something that's important too, because sometimes people say, well, there's not a court order, or, like I just have an informal arrangement with the child's guardian, then you want to show that there's something happening. Are you sending money back? If this child is abroad, are you sending money back home? If you have Western Union receipts, if you are giving some cash to the child, whoever the child's living with, maybe you're going to get a letter from them, something like that to show I'm meeting my obligations, okay? Because it's beyond whether or not the court says that you have an obligation. It's just a right thing to do if you have a child who's not living with you. Voting is on there too. It's a very short line. If you're not a citizen, you should not have voted. Voting when you're not supposed to is actually a pretty serious issue because it also pulls in things about claiming to be a U.S. citizen when you're not, which is actually a much more serious thing than just like a good moral character issue. Anyone who says, if you're talking to someone and they say, well, when I voted for Obama or whatever, that has to set off a red flag for you. Non-citizens may not vote in federal elections. I don't think they can vote in any elections in the state or the city. There was a time when you could vote on school board elections and things like that, but you cannot vote in federal elections. This is a really big deal. It has to get discussed with someone before they file that application. Okay. Next is English language and the civics. So there, as I mentioned in the beginning, that there's a requirement to be able to read, write, and speak basic English. There are a couple of exceptions to that. Oh, that's the next page. Okay, fine. So the first thing is that during in addition to the language, there's also the civics. So the test is 100 questions, which may or may not be in the chapter 1. But out of those 100 questions, the test consists of 10 of those questions. The applicant has to answer 6 of them correctly. I feel like it used to be much looser, but now when you go into the interview, there's actually 10 questions on a list. They have to ask you those. If you get the first 6 right, that's the end of the test. If you get some of them wrong, they'll go up to 10. And if you can't get 6 of them, you're eligible for 1 retest on the same application. So you'll file the application. Say I filed it in January. My interview was yesterday, and I failed the test, which hopefully I wouldn't, but I failed the test yesterday. They'll give me 1 retest in about a month. If I fail it again, then that N400 is no good. That application is denied. But hopefully I would pass. There are exemptions for certain long-time permanent residents and for people with disabilities, so that's what I'm going to get to next. Oh, no, it's not a slide. So the exemptions, so for the English language, the requirement to be able to read, write, and speak English and do the interview in English, you can be exempt from it if you're over a certain age and you have your residence for certain periods of time. So the time periods are if you're over 50 years old and you have your green card for more than 20 years, if you're a permanent resident more than 20 years, or if you're over 55 years old and you've been a resident for more than 15 years. In those cases, you would still need to take the civics test, but the interview and the test would be in your native language. Does that make sense? And then there's no literacy requirement. So that actually, if you're a native English speaker but you don't read and write, if you have the number of years in, then you don't have to do the reading and writing test. Does that make sense? Okay. As far as the disabilities goes, the exemptions for people with disabilities, if you have a mental or physical condition that makes it so that you're incapable of learning new information, a doctor can fill out another form. It's the N648. you're interested to know the number of it, but if the doctor fills out the form and says, you know, this is my patient for a long time, she's had 3 strokes over however much time, and that's debilitated her brain's ability to do whatever doctor stuff they say, and that affects the applicant's ability to read, write, and speak English, it makes it so that she's not able to learn new information. If USCIS evaluates that form and finds that it's sufficient, then the applicant would be excused from whatever it is that the doctor says. So if the doctor says, okay, she can't, because of whatever the mental or physical condition is, she can't read, write, or speak English, but if he doesn't check, if the doctor doesn't check off the civics part, then I still have to take the test, right? But if the doctor checks off all of them, then I would be excused from all of them. For native English speakers who have disabilities, you know, it would say that they'd be able to speak English if they do, but it might check off that they can't read, write, and they might not be able to do the civics. Okay, so there are, so those exemptions exist. I would say they're not easy. The age ones are easy because you just have to have your residence for a certain period of time, and you have to be a certain age. That's all you need. But as far as the form that the doctor fills out, they are pretty tough. I think it's one of the areas that that USCIS thinks that there's a high level of fraud or some kind of trickery going on there. And so sometimes doctors don't understand the legal standard, and so they'll say, you know, this is an elderly person, she came from a poor country and didn't have the opportunity to go to school, and, you know, she's old, you got to excuse her. And, you know, that's not a mental or physical condition that USCIS accepts. It has to be something that there's a connection to the disease or disability and the ability to learn. Other ones might be like, you know, the person has diabetes and high blood pressure, like that, you know, that generally doesn't have a correlation with a person's ability to learn new information, so that would be a weak one, those kind of things. Okay, what's next? The oath of allegiance is a requirement to become a naturalized citizen. The applicant needs to swear off allegiance to other countries and says that they're going to be faithful to the United States, that they'd be willing to bear arms if they needed to, and those kind of things. The oath actually is written out in the end of the N-400 form, so if you haven't looked at it, you can take a look at it. Again, that's in Chapter 1. The applicant needs to understand what the oath is and what the obligations of the oath are, and they also have to be willing to take the oath. So it sounds like minor points, but it's actually important to make those distinctions. There are certain exceptions to parts of the oath based on strongly held beliefs that are still, I think the immigration still requires some sort of like higher power kind of religious kind of thing, but there are certain religions where you can't swear, and so you can't swear your allegiance to a country, and so if you'd have to get back up from the church elders to show that, well, this is a person who's been practicing in this religion for this period of time. In our religious practice, we don't do X, Y, and Z, and so please give this person a modified oath. Another one is if you're not allowed to bear arms, if you're not allowed to kill people as part of your religious belief, you wouldn't be able to swear that you'd be willing to bear arms on behalf of the United States if your religious beliefs don't let you do that. And so there are exceptions for that. Those things are interesting. I mean, I don't know that they're ever going to come up on a call in the call-in, but it's just, you know, I think they're just maybe interesting things to note. Okay, so let me see how we're doing. I think we're doing good, right? All right, so I have 15 minutes to cover. So that's naturalization. Now you know everything. The last 15 minutes I'm going to talk about acquisition and derivation of citizenship, which is, again, people who are not, this applies to children, people who are either born and they're United States citizens at birth, or people who are not born U.S. citizens but become U.S. citizens while they're minors, okay? And again, it's like all the way in the morning, I know, but a couple of people touched on the difference between acquisition and derivation of citizenship. For acquisition of citizenship, that generally refers to people who are born citizens, even if they were not born in the United States. So at the time that so that there's never a day that they were not a U.S. citizen, all right? chapter in the training manual that relates to acquisition and derivation is Chapter 2. The important parts, well, I'm sure that the text part is important, but at the end of the chapter are a couple of charts that are useful because they list out what the laws to show whether or not the person who's born outside of the United States is indeed a U.S. citizen when they're born. Basically, the thing that you're looking at, or the thing that the person wants to look at to see whether or not they were a citizen when they were born, is what's the status of the parents, and not just immigration status, but you also want to know, were the parents married to each other? Because there's still a distinction in the older laws about whether a person is born in or out of wedlock. So that's the number one question, is the parents' marital status. There may be questions about legitimation or paternity of the parents, paternity of the father. And then the most important part, which sometimes is the hardest part to prove, is the parents' residence in the United States. The law usually requires that the parent, who's a U.S. citizen, lived in the United States for certain periods of time, including as an adult, in order to transmit their U.S. citizenship status to their child. Does that make sense? And the chart will list it out. So say I'm 8.5 months pregnant, and I have the opportunity to go on vacation, and I just have to take it, and somehow I manage to get on the plane, and I'm in, think of somewhere good. Okay, wherever you said. So I'm away. I'm outside of the U.S. Everyone's, Antigua, there you go. I'm visiting my friend's parents' house. So my friend's family's house. So I'm abroad. I have the baby in Antigua. Is the baby a U.S. citizen or not? So that's what you're going to look at, okay? Am I married? Does it make a difference? And the charts in the back are going to help you through it. I don't think we're going to have time to work through the charts together, which would have been nice. But anyway, so am I married? Because the marital status of the parents is number one. What was the number two question? Oh, is there an issue of legitimation? And did I reside in the United States for the right periods of time? So, for example, if the one citizen parent has to be physically in the U.S., say for 5 years, half of that time I had to be over 14 years old. If I just left on vacation, and we assume that I've been here the whole rest of my life, then my child would be a U.S. citizen, right? Because I just took off for a little bit and I had that baby. Things would be different, for example, if, I'm probably doing poll questions, but not realizing it. All right, so let's do a poll question. Esperanza was born in Puerto Rico in 1960. She was raised there. In 1980, when she was 20, she moved to Mexico. Okay. In 1982, she met and married Santos, who is a citizen of Mexico. Their child, Pedro, was born on February 16, 1989. Is Pedro a U.S. citizen? I guess we will use this. Does everybody have their books? Okay. So, answer me this. Is Pedro a U.S. citizen? And your choices are no, because Esperanza was not present in the United States for at least 5 years after age 14. B, yes, because Esperanza was present in the U.S. or its outlying possessions for at least 5 years before Pedro was born, 2 of which were over 14. C, no, because Pedro never lived inside the United States. Or D, yes, Esperanza and Santos were married when Pedro was born. Answer. Oh, thank you. Oh, see, I can't read and push the button and talk all at the same time. So the answer is B, yes, because Esperanza was present in the U.S. or its outlying possession, recalling that Puerto Rico is an outlying possession of the United States, for at least 5 years before Pedro was born, 2 of which were over age 14. So when you look at the chart in the back, is everyone there on page 41? Yeah? Okay, so the facts say, I think not me. Esperanza's married to Santos. So the child born in wedlock. Okay, born in 1989, right? So if you go to page 41, if you look on the first column, it's a date. when is the law effective? So if you go all the way to the bottom, you'll see for people who were born on or after November 14, 1986, that's Pedro. Does he have both parents are citizens? One parent citizen and one national, or one citizen and one alien or non-citizen parent? So he's the bottom one, right? Because Santos is Mexican. The citizen parent, that's Esperanza, has been physically present in the U.S. or outlying possession for 5 years, at least 2 of which were after she was 14. And if you look at the facts, she lived in Puerto Rico from the time she was born until she was 20, right? So she squarely meets that requirement. Pedro is a U.S. citizen. All right? So that is that question. And that's so funny because I was just going to make up the same exact question, but probably with different names. So that's acquisition in a nutshell. Let's see. I'm going to cheat and go on ahead a little bit. Okay. So what the person needs to show, in that case, what would happen is that Pedro's parents would go to the U.S. consulate in the country where they are in Mexico and say, Esperanza would say, hi, I'm a U.S. citizen. Here's my proof of that. This is my child, Pedro. He was born. I meet all the requirements. So Esperanza would register his birth abroad. It's registering the birth of a U.S. citizen child abroad. Okay? So that's how that works. All right. The next topic is derivation. Derivation of citizenship is for people who were not citizens when they were born. Okay, so when they're born, they're citizens of whatever country they're from, and then immigrate to the United States. And when they're still minors, as permanent residents, living with a parent that naturalizes and becomes a citizen, that child would automatically become a citizen. Okay, so that is I guess that's one on the first slide there. The rules for that, or the charts for that, are on the next page. Or the next page. So on page 43 in Chapter 2 is the chart for who derives citizenship, the law in effect at the time when the child derives citizenship. So hopefully there'll be a poll question about that too. But first I'll just talk a little bit about it generally. The important thing about both acquisition and derivation of citizenship is that it happens by operation of law, which means it happens automatically. Whether the parents want it to happen, whether the child wants it to happen, doesn't matter. If all the criteria are met for deriving citizenship, that child is automatically a U.S. citizen. Okay? And the other thing to note about it is under the definition of child, you're going to see that derivation of citizenship applies to biological children and adopted children, but it does not apply to stepchildren. Okay? So that's important to note about who derives citizenship. So, on the chart on page 43, you'll see that the law in effect at the time, right now, has been effective since February 2001, February 27, 2001. And so that's what this rule is here. There are other older rules that you'll be able to read through if you're interested, that may come up if you're talking to somebody who's older, right? But for our purposes, we're just going to cover the current law, which requires that the child is unmarried, under 18, a lawful permanent resident, and resides in the legal and physical custody of the U.S. citizen parent. Okay? So those are the things, the 1, 2, 3, 4. Those are the 4 things that need to happen in order for that child to derive citizenship through the parent. Okay? The last bullet is for what so the last bullet is the important part. At least one of the parents has to be a citizen, okay? Whether they're born a citizen, whether they became a citizen, doesn't matter, as they have to be able to show that I'm under 18, I'm not married, here's my permanent residence, proof that I'm a permanent resident, and I'm in the legal and physical custody of this U.S. citizen parent, okay? Under the current law, it always sounds harder when I say it, but it doesn't matter on those 4 criteria, it doesn't matter which one comes first. As long as all 4 criteria are met, the child has derived citizenship. Does that make sense? So it doesn't matter if the parent became a citizen first and then the child got their residence, or if the child got their residence from some other way and, and the parent became a citizen later. It doesn't matter. As long as under 18, not married, permanent resident, living in the legal physical custody of a U.S. citizen parent, it doesn't matter. The order of events doesn't matter as long as all four things are met. Does that make sense? Okay. And then on that chart, the important thing is whenever the last thing happens, whenever the last of the four criteria are met, that's the law in effect at that time is what governs whether or not the person derives citizenship. And so that also sounds a little more complicated. So when you're looking at the chart, like if the child met all of the requirements, like before February 27, 2001, you got to look at the older law. Okay, and so that's what you're looking at. If all this stuff happened in the 1940s, then you got to look at a way old law like that. And so that the law in the effect at the time that these criteria were met is what you're looking at, okay? All right, so why does that not look like mine? Oh, because it's this one. Okay. So, and then again, this born in wedlock, out of wedlock thing still can make a difference when you're talking about derivation of citizenship, so just to keep an eye on that. It's generally easier when it's the mom who's the one who's becoming a citizen, because proving that relationship generally is easier, especially in terms of if the father was never married to the mother, or if if the father's not on the birth certificate, those kind of things. Okay, so that's what that slide is. All right, so I already talked about this. We already looked at the chart, right? But the important part is to know that whenever these things happen, whenever these criteria are met, you're going to look at the law that's in effect at the time, okay? All right, so we are on the whole question. So this question is about whether or not Milagros derived U.S. citizenship. So Milagros was born in 2003 in the Dominican Republic. Shortly thereafter, her parents passed away. Her aunt adopted her in 2006, and Milagros has been living in her legal and physical custody since then. In 2009, her mother married a U.S. citizen who petitioned for her and Milagros to become permanent residents. In 2010, Milagros and her adopted mother were admitted to the U.S. as LPRs, as permanent residents. In 2014, Milagros' mother naturalized and became a U.S. citizen. And the question is whether or not Milagros is a U.S. citizen. Is she? Choices are no, because adopted children cannot derive U.S. citizenship. B, yes, she derived citizenship in 2014 when her mother naturalized, because adopted children can derive citizenship. C, no, because stepchildren cannot derive citizenship. And D, yes, Milagros derived citizenship in 2010 because even though she's the stepchild of a U.S. citizen who petitioned for her, she was still legally adopted by her mother. Answer? B. Good, I know. So Milagros derived because her mother was a citizen and adopted children can derive. So I'm getting kicked off, but here's, I thought there was going to be another thing for me. But okay, so don't forget the training manual, chapters 1 and 2. Those are the most important ones because they're mine. But, all the resources are there. Chapter 11, also very important because everyone's going to need referrals. And there's, we usually bombard all of the legal service offices throughout the city during call-in week. And they're all like, oh, they get such an overflow of calls because we're referring people to them from the call-in, but that's fine. Just keep doing it. Refer, that's what we're here for. So have a good time at the call-in, and I'll see you there.
Thank you, Midori. Now, for our next session, we have two speakers. We're going to cover call-in tips and procedures. And our speakers are Tamara Bloom, who's the legal coordinator for CUNY Citizenship Now, and Stina Rosenquist, who is the volunteer engagement coordinator for CUNY Citizenship Now. A round of applause for our speakers. You have the clicker here.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom Shea. Hi, everyone. Hey. I know we're the only thing standing between you guys and coffee time, but let's pick it up. Are you guys ready for policies and procedures? Come on! Woo! Before we get started, I want to embarrass Stina for a moment. I would like everyone to give Stina a round of applause. For those of you who are older volunteers or newer volunteers, please get to know Stina. Sorry. Please feel free to ask her any questions that you have during the call-in. She's here to help. She's here to engage with you guys, and so she's doing an amazing job. We're so happy to have her, and I just want to make sure that you know that she's available, not me, for any questions that you have. Just kidding.
All right, everyone, thank you so much for being here. I know you're giving up a precious day just to be here, so thank you again. We want to give you a better idea of our policies and procedures for the call-in. Can I see a show of hands? Who's been to the call-in before? Wow. So some impressive veterans that are back to join us. So even for those of you who've been before, we just want to clarify kind of how we use the phone and all of that. And as you know, some of you who've been to the call-in, those phones can be quite pesky. So we're just going to give a brief overview of the basics of how to answer the phone and how to deal with callers. So just quickly, I think hopefully everyone knows this by this point. I've sent you maybe one too many emails with this piece of information. But just to clarify, we're going to be at Gutman Community College for the call-in. That's where we were last year, across from Bryant Park, 50 West 40th Street. You have an information sheet in your folder that has this information just to clarify. And remember, on those days that we're holding the call-in, there are shifts. Hopefully all of you have registered for the specific shifts that work for your schedule. If anything has changed, feel free to email and let us know, and we can rearrange your schedule. Finally, you received an email at about noon today, so you can check your phones later. And in that email, it was a reminder to submit your bio. And just so you know, everyone got that email, even if you've submitted your bio. So if you know you've submitted your bio, ignore it. If not, please submit your bio by tonight if you'd like it to be included on our website and for it to be shared via social media. So 11:59. If you have not submitted it yet, 11:59. You already know this by this point, hopefully, but just a few things. As you know, the call-in is providing free, confidential, high-quality information to callers who have immigration questions. We're looking to provide reliable referrals to authorized immigrant service providers, and we're hoping that this is an opportunity for all of you to learn more about immigration and to really make an impact on the lives of immigrants in New York and beyond.
So just a reminder again of some do's and don'ts for the week. The most important thing, everybody keeps reiterating, all of the presenters, is to provide information and a referral. Do not provide legal advice. I'm not going to beat a dead horse, but everybody heard this over and over again, so we hope that it's clear what this means. The other thing that's very important is not just to provide the information, but where can people go to get help? Provide directed referrals to the appropriate authorized immigration legal service provider. That's one of the most important things you're going to do this week, connecting people with the resources that are available to help them. You do not need to only refer callers to Citizenship Now. We have a pretty distinct scope of services for the types of cases that we do. So for example, we were talking earlier about VAWA cases. Those really require the attention of a person, an attorney, to guide the applicant along. And for example, CUNY Citizenship Now doesn't provide assistance with VAWA petitions. There's going to be a list of organizations that do this work all the time for you to send people to. So you're going to see in your referral packets, which are available at the call-in, information about how to direct people to the appropriate place. If people want information about how to obtain the services of a private attorney, we have two referral means available. One is online, the AILA Lawyer Search website, and the other is the New York City Bar Association. We do not allow attorneys or people who work for private, for-profit organizations to send callers directly for themselves. So if I volunteer at the call-in and I'm a private attorney and I want to drum a business and I say, come to the law office of Tamara Bloom and I will help you. That's something that you want to let Stina know if you hear people doing, because we don't allow that. We want people to volunteer for the sake of volunteering. People's information is available in their bio. So hopefully people know what good private practitioners are out there to help people. Another thing I just want to draw everybody's attention to is in your volunteer packets, if you want to check it out, the volunteer guidelines. Just some key policies and procedures. We do not want anyone to be making private referrals. We have a zero tolerance policy. So the thing I just mentioned, zero tolerance. We're going to ask you to leave if we see you doing that. We don't want anybody to take the names of callers. We don't want you to give your name, hi, this is Tamara, how can I help you? We have a greeting that we'll go over more in detail later, but we want to make sure that people who come from, maybe smaller immigrant communities where they feel like people know everybody, know that this is confidential, that we're not going to share the information with people. Oh my God, I got this call about this guy, and we want to make sure that people know that we're respecting their privacy, we're not taking names, and we're not giving our names either. And all of these policies and procedures, when you register to attend our events and when you register to become a member of the Volunteer Corps, you're attesting that you've read and you understand all of these policies, but a copy can be found in your folders today and via email when you register for events. So we want to give some tips and advice about how to handle all of these calls, because what you've heard this morning and what you just heard from Midori is kind of all of the legal substance of the kinds of questions people are going to ask. But what happens when the phone actually rings? How do we process all the information we heard today to be able to provide it to the callers? So we're going to go over step by step some of our advice for how to actually answer the calls. And I have no idea who that person is in the photo. That person was like many, many hours of sleep ago. So if you see her around, I don't know what she's doing, but I have a lot of advice for her about what's happening, what her future looks like.
Okay, so step one. You have step one in your folder right now. You will also have it on the desk in front of you when you sit down in front of a phone at the call-in. So this is called the Getting Started handout. I think it's pretty self-explanatory what it's going to help you do. And it's actually a very small image here, but when you pull it out of your folder, you'll be able to see there are a few pictures that will hopefully help clarify how to use the phones and just how to kind of approach each phone call. So step two, when your phone rings and you panic a little bit and then you pick it up, you'll have either a headset or you'll actually be picking up the phone receiver. And so you are going to start every call with this greeting, and we have this greeting that's on this slide, also on your Getting Started handout, in English and in Spanish. And again, you don't need to bring your whole folder with you. We'll have this in front of you at your desk when you're answering phones at the call-in. This greeting is both a way of protecting you and helping the caller. It's a reminder to them of what services we can provide and what they can expect from that phone call.
So the next thing that we want to give you some advice about is how to gather facts, how to think about each call, how to understand what the person's asking for, even if they don't know the terms, or they're not going to use words like adjustment of status or consular processing. We want to make sure you can translate whatever you've learned today from all of the presentations into something that actually allows you to connect the information to the resources you have, and so that you can pass it along to the person you're speaking to, who also probably isn't a lawyer and who wouldn't understand those terms anyway, in a friendly, approachable, easy to understand way. So What's the goal of the person who's calling? Do they want citizenship? Are they calling to ask about a green card for themselves? Are they looking to bring a family member here? Are they interested in DACA and DAPA, but are concerned because they're not sure what's going to happen with the lawsuit? They may have other concerns. I want to become a citizen, but I have a criminal conviction. How's that going to affect me? They may be worried that they don't speak enough English to become a citizen. They may also be worried about paying for the fee, so we want to provide them with some information about how to obtain a fee waiver, which we didn't really discuss at today's presentation. Think about, in your minds, the concerns they have or the issues that they're raising so that you can make people feel comfortable, and that way they feel comfortable giving information to you over the phone. People are going to be giving you a lot of sensitive information, a lot of details about, their past or, oh my God, about, criminal history. So you want to make sure you're listening carefully and you're picking out the things that are important to be able to answer their question. So what are the resources that you have in front of you? What are the resources I need to answer the questions? We keep talking about the training manual. We talked about the handout of the visa bulletin. Tom asked you guys to take it out of your folder so that we could walk through the steps together. Midori went through the acquisition and derivation charts for you. One more other important resource, the Citizenship Now staff. So there's a lot of Citizenship Now staff in the house. Raise your hands. Everybody's kind of in the back and in the front here. Please look around and get to know our faces so that if you raise your hand, you're comfortable asking us questions. Take one of the blank note cards that we're going to hand out and ask some questions to the panelists. Get as much information as you can, understand as much as you can, so that you know where to look and you don't feel overwhelmed. The next step is providing the information, actually giving people the answers to their questions. So, we spoke about listening attentively. We're getting calls from all over the place, sometimes different parts of the country where people speak much slower than we do here in New York City, sometimes from older people, sometimes from younger people, people from all different countries and backgrounds. So not everybody presents their story to you in the same way. Listen closely. People may come at you 100 miles an hour because they're so excited to speak to somebody finally about a question they've never asked. Make sure that you feel free to put that person on hold so you can gather your thoughts, so you can write things down, so you can look up information. Make sure that you check the training manual for relevant answers. Raise your stop sign paddle. Make sure you get help. You're under no pressure to answer 1 million phone calls. You can take your time and go through things slowly to make sure that you're comfortable with the answer you're providing and also looking it up or double-checking information with the supervisor. Another important thing that we're doing when we provide information is steering people out of harm's way from getting, help, quote unquote, from unscrupulous people who are out to take advantage of them. Many people on the phone may have been a victim of immigration fraud. Maybe they were, had their money taken and somebody filed an application for them that, put them in harm's way. Or, maybe they've never talked to anybody about their immigration case before because they kind of knew they were filing something that wasn't going to help them. Refer people who have been the victim of immigration fraud to these two places, the New York County District Attorney's Office as well as the New York State Office of the Attorney General. Sometimes, people are put behind bars for defrauding immigrants. There also may be money that's available to people so they can get back what they paid this person or the fees that they've paid to these offices over time. It's a really important resource that you guys should feel comfortable providing to people so that they can, move forward with their cases. And again, this is what the question mark sign looks like, and you're going to raise it if you have questions. We keep a ratio of one supervising attorney or BIA accredited rep to each 4 to 6 call answerers. This way, we can stand behind you guys, listen to what you're saying, see if you need help you direct, get some more information. How long did he say he had his green card for? Well, maybe he wants to become a citizen. We want to be able to help move you forward and be accessible to you if you have questions. And, the information that is in your training packets today will also be on your desks right in front of your phone so that you have a little practice using them now and you remember what they are for later.
Okay, so those of you who've been to a call-in before know how important making referrals is. That's a lot of what we end up doing at the call-in. So in order to make referrals, we're going to be using a couple different resources. You have some general info in your training manual that you can look at. And you will, again, also have a referral packet in front of you. Ken Ramsey is going to be coming on after the coffee break to discuss a little bit more about the specifics of referrals. Again, we're keeping this confidential. We're not giving out any information, and we're not taking any specific information about the caller in terms of their name or anything like that. Make sure when you're making these referrals that you're managing the expectations of people. A lot of times, different organizations have a slightly different way of doing things. So if we're referring a caller to an immigration organization, we want to make sure that they know that this immigration organization might have kind of a wait list for whatever service they're requesting. They might have a nominal fee, and we tried to note that in our training manual as well. We just want to make sure that we're setting people up for a good experience, that we're not setting them up for disappointment, and we're doing our best to walk them through, but then we're ultimately kind of handing it off to them to pursue their own path, and we want to make sure that they are being realistic about it. So finally, one last important thing. We do each year a caller survey, and what that means is that when you come in for a shift and you sit down at your phone, you'll get 3 caller surveys in front of you. So that means, hopefully, you're going to be answering more calls than 3. But for just those 3 first calls, if you can fill in this information for us, it's incredibly helpful. So on this caller survey, we're asking for basic information. Again, no one's name, nothing like that. But we're asking for basic information about where the caller is calling from, what type of issues they're calling about, and this will help us make our training and our call-in even better next year. So we really ask for your help with that.
I just want a round of applause if you enjoy that Stina and I coordinated our outfits for this presentation. I'm killing time, actually, because we're a little farther ahead than we thought we would be. We did try to choreograph a dance, but we won't be doing it. I'm sorry. Maybe at the reception. You can, or maybe privately, we'll do it for you guys. So the last thing we want to point out are some sections in the training manual that we are not discussing today, but are going to be very valuable and important. So we did discuss naturalization. You want to keep that handy, section 1. We discussed citizenship for children. Midori just spoke about it. That's section 2. Section 6, document renewal and replacement. That means someone will call and say, I lost my certificate of naturalization. What do I do? Or I lost my green card. How do I replace it? Or somebody, for some reason, I got a green card and it says I'm female instead of male. What do I do? How do I fix it? The answer to those questions will be in section 6. How do I obtain copies of my immigration or criminal records? That's in section 9. That information is valuable for people who, like we discussed earlier, are not quite sure what their immigration history is. They may have outstanding orders of deportation. We can explain to people how they can request copies of their immigration records. How to obtain copies of criminal records. Basically, the answer to that question is we always want to send people to the clerk in the court in the county where they were arrested, and that information for all of the different boroughs is in your training manual as well. If people want to know how much certain immigration forms cost, how long it takes for USCIS to process certain things, if I file an I-130 for my mother, how many months can I expect to wait before I can get an approval of that application? All of that information, including the poverty guidelines, which we talked about earlier, how much money do I need to make to sponsor a family member? Or there's a different set of poverty guidelines that apply when we're talking about people who may or may not qualify for a fee waiver for naturalization. All that information will be in section 10. And the most important section, which you actually don't have in front of you and you will at the call-in, is this referral packet. There's a whole presentation immediately after hours, after the coffee break, to get you comfortable with how to make referrals, how to direct people to the appropriate organization. There's also information in the training manual about in-state tuition for CUNY. Some other things that's very tiny, I can't see. But it's really, really useful, and also many people have given us the compliment of telling us that this is useful, even after the call-in. People do work with immigrants, and they bring this with them, and it helps them answer a lot of the questions that they have. So with that, we will pause a bit early for coffee break. Keep it going, model our outfits again. Okay, done. Just kidding. Enjoy coffee, and we'll see you back here shortly.
Can I get another round of applause for Stina and Tamara? It was a great presentation. Thank you. So we will reconvene at 3:45.